Hi guys, welcome back to VUDivulged. I'm Allie.
I'm Josie.
And I'm Josh.
And today we're going to be talking about attorney generals and kind of what their roles and responsibilities are, how they originated, and how they kind of impact the United States today. So first, I'm going to kind of get into the background of how attorney generals became a thing and how that led to what they are now. And so some of the early origins have a lot of English influence. So the concept of the attorney general has traced back to medieval England. The role of an attorney general was first established in the 13th century under the reign of King Edward I. In England, the Attorney General was the principal legal advisor to the monarch and had the responsibility of representing the crown in legal matters. So it's pretty similar to what they do today. And the Judiciary Act of 1789 created the Office of the Attorney General. So that's kind of how it originated in the United States. And the increasing workload led to the creation of the Department of Justice in 1870, led by the Attorney General. And as states formed their own governments, each state also created its own attorney general to represent the state's legal interests, similar to how the federal attorney general worked for the nation. In fact, the position of state attorney general became formalized in the early 19th century as each state adopted its own legal framework.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then, so I'm going to talk about some of the responsibilities and duties of an attorney general, at least on a federal level. Which operates under the Office of the Attorney General. It manages the DOJ's 40 offices, boards, divisions, and bureaus, and occasionally appears before the Supreme Court for matters of extreme importance. When it comes to state attorney generals, each state's attorney general has slightly different duties, but generally their role mirrors that of the federal attorney general. And so they also provide informal legal advice, informed legal opinions to the governor, state officials, and legislature. In some states, they can review legislation before it's passed. They also represent the state agencies, and state officers in litigation, as well as enforce state civil and criminal law. And they also have the responsibility of supervising local prosecutors, only in some states though. They are an unofficial watchdog for unethical legal practices in the governor. So they kind of keep an eye on everything and they make sure all the legal aspects are handled smoothly and correctly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it isn't unofficial, so it doesn't mean like they're
Right.
they're always doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, it is still an elected position for some states?
It's elected for some, it's appointed for others.
Yeah, it's elected for the majority of states.
I
find it interesting that it took from the inception of the Attorney General in, 1789 all the way to 1870 for the Department of Justice to be formed, which I can only guess the reasons why. Like, you probably know a little bit better than me why, but
Oh wow, that's after after the Civil War
yeah,
too.
13 years after the Civil War, the Attorney General was created in the U.S.
I
Or the
imagine
Department of Justice is created.
I imagine they probably had an informal kind of Department of Justice. I
Yeah.
mean, this is still, I'm sure they had legal counsel or some kind of legal advisors up until that point. It probably just wasn't under a specific agency, kind of like a lot of our other agencies. They were still kind of there, but it wasn't officially formed until that period.
Yeah.
I would also be interested to know who would have been responsible for that. Were they appointed then, or did they just seek, I don't know. I'll have to look into that a little bit more.
Yeah.
Interesting. Might have. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say it might have helped with just funding in general, just to make funding easier to allocate resources for.
Yeah. Especially seeing as during this time, like the U.S. as a nation was really coming into its, more towards what it is nowadays. So for me, it makes a lot more sense that it would be formed in 1870, more because that was sort of right after the American Civil War ended, 5 years after. So I can see why there would be a need for the Department of Justice to have been created during this time. Like, the increase in workload, as you stated earlier, would just probably be fairly enormous during this time in U.S. history because the South is being reintegrated into the U.S. and also reforms and laws, especially concerning formerly enslaved individuals with voting and such. A lot of Jim Crow going on at this time.
Yeah,
Makes
that
sense.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Now those duties, just saying them like probably is so abstract to think about. It helps to understand the impact the Attorney General can have on the policy of the United States. Like certain Attorney Generals have really impacted the United States, like with the 71st Attorney General, Edward Levy, who issued the first of the Attorney General investigative guidelines on domestic security investigations. And obviously, the United States is very concerned with domestic security. And these are known as the Levy guidelines. And these limit the FBI's ability to use techniques such as wiretaps without specific evidence. So that kind of ties into domestic security policy, and that's just an example of how the Attorney General can overreach beyond just advising the cabinet or the president on legal matters. And this is just the federal Attorney General. I'm sure the state Attorney Generals can have a large impact on their states as well. But there's another Attorney General, the 73rd, Benjamin Civiletti, who argued on the behalf of Americans who were being held hostage during the Iran hostage crisis during Jimmy Carter's presidency. And he also argued for the right of governments to denaturalize Nazi war criminals. So beyond just policy, they can do just normal attorney things and also affect our foreign policy as well with like the Iran hostage crisis and the impacts of certain wars like Nazi war criminals. And additionally, they can affect the very structure of the government itself. The Benjamin Civiletti, the same attorney that I was talking about, the 73rd, kind of helped with like partial government shutdowns because he stated opinions that interpreted the Constitution to state that unless there's a spending bill agreement that Congress cannot operate. So they have a hand in the government structure as well. And again, many attorneys have their hand in like say the war on drugs like during the 80s and perpetuating like perhaps the Patriot Act in the early 2000s after 9/11 attacks. So they have a very broad scope of what they can do. And they can even preside over certain like attacks or events in the U.S. like the Waco siege, the capture of the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, or the conviction of the two men responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing.
Yeah.
And all those incidents can be traced back to Janet Reno, who was the 78th Attorney General, and coincidentally, the first African American Attorney General. And of course, going back to the whole legal aspect of their job, Eric Holder, the 82nd Attorney General, directed the Department of Justice to abstain from defending the Defense of Marriage Act, which effectively reduced the government's role in discriminating against gay marriage and homosexual rights. So the broad scope of legal, of protecting rights, arguing for our American citizens, like in the Iran hostage crisis, to stuff like the war on drugs, the terrorists in the United States, and everything like that. So that's just to give you an idea of like how much impact the Attorney General really has in our government.
It's really interesting that you mentioned, Janet Reno,
Mhm.
with the whole Waco siege and the Unabomber. And because I never thought that an attorney general would have that much power or say, or like that much influence over domestic terrorism issues, but it's really interesting that those all kind of, I had no idea that Janet Reno was, had any part of that.
Yeah, she actually directed I will say, attack onto the cult that was what the concern was. She directed military officers, the officers onto that, that building. So she wasn't just like involved with like the aftermath, the legal aftermath of that, but she was directly involved in the attack itself.
That's really interesting. That's way more power than I would have ever thought an attorney general would have over something like that.
Yeah.
Domestic terrorism, that's a big responsibility right there.
However, whenever you look at it, the main agency involved with the Waco siege against the Branch Davidians was going to be the ATF, which is one of the largest, I'd say, federal agencies out there whenever it comes to law enforcement. So it's somewhat surprising about how much power the Attorney General actually has.
Well, that was when the ATF and the FBI really butt heads, and that's when they had to kind of differentiate those. They had to balance those powers a little bit better under the Department of Justice.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. And I mean, of course, these attorney generals have to get selected somehow, and the process of doing that is different on at least a state level. Every state has their own attorney general, and every state elects it differently. There's 4 ways that they can be chosen. The most popular is to be elected by the general populace of their states, and that's in at least 43 states. So it's a vast majority of the United States. But of course, they can also be appointed by their governor, and only 5 states do this: Alaska, Hawaii, New Hampshire, New Jersey, and Wyoming. And not only by the governor, but they can instead be appointed by the state legislature, like in Maine, or appointed by the state Supreme Court itself, like in Tennessee. But on the federal level, it's not as democratic, because on a federal level, the U.S. Attorney General is nominated by the President of the United States under the Appointments Clause granted to him in the Constitution. And they have to go through a confirmation hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and only needs to be confirmed by the majority. The confirmation hearing will include a background check and financial disclosures. The person may be questioned about their qualifications, views on public policy, and past professional conduct. So that also kind of ties into the whole fact that attorney generals have more power than just their legal expertise, as in, you could see with being questioned on their views on public policy, they also have a hand in directing public policy of the United States. And they also, in the confirmation hearing, they may pull in supporters and opponents of the nominee. So it's a very rigorous process to be the United States Attorney General, as compared to the more democratic, you'd run for election portion of most states and everything like that.
Well, and then there's the district attorneys underneath that, and I think the appointment process for them is probably similar to how the attorney general is, because I imagine in states where they're usually appointed, they're still going to be continued to be appointed for district attorneys, and then states where they're elected, it's probably also an election process, but I guess it could differ depending on the state.
I can see that being the case. And whenever it comes to appointments by presidents for their attorney generals, it depends greatly upon how they're going to actually be confirmed or not. Like, would a candidate get more confirmed if they actually had background as in law, or if it was just a purely political move by that president who was going to be implementing, well, not implementing, but appointing this attorney general. Like, I can see how that could affect like a choice for an attorney general, because whenever you look at it, most attorney generals, whenever they get appointed, don't stay around after that president's gone. The majority of them do not. And I find that interesting.
Well, it kind of leads into what some of the qualifications are, but the
Yeah.
way I kind of see it is it's kind of like just selecting your attorney. I mean, there are
Mhm.
qualifications that you're going to want to have for your legal counsel, but at the end of the day, it's still up to you to get to pick who you want to help you with legal matters.
Yeah.
And so some of the qualifications, at least at the state level, or first of all, 20 of the states don't actually require a law degree, which I find really interesting.
Yeah.
And then there's usually an age requirement, and 35 states specify a minimum age. Well, 15 of them have no formal specification. And a lot of these age specifications can range from 18 to 30 years old. Indiana has no specific age range. So, and then also residential status has something to do with it. 43 states have a formal provision stating an attorney general must be a state resident, while 7 do not have a formal provision. Of the 43 states, 25 of the 43 states that have a formal provision, 25 specify the number of years, and 18 of them do not. So specific years that they've mentioned have ranged from 30 days to 7 years. And in Indiana, it's usually a minimum of 2 years.
Yeah.
So just depends on the state and where you're at. And then there's usually a citizenship status. So 40 states have a formal provision stating an attorney general must be a United States citizen. 10 of them do not have a formal provision. Of the 40 states that do have a formal provision, 5 of those states specify the number of years, and 35 of them do not. In Indiana, you must be a citizen for at least 2 years. And voter registration also has something to do with it, because 30 states have a formal provision stating an attorney general must be a qualified voter, while 20 do not have a formal provision. Of the 30 states, only one, Oklahoma, specifies the number of years, and 29 do not. So
Wow.
you'd think there'd be a little bit more qualification. Well, I don't want to say more qualifications, but more specific when they do have qualifications.
Yeah. But
And
I can also see why they don't, because it's not really an appointed, it's an elected position in most of the states, which if you take a look at other positions like a local county sheriff, a lot of counties do not require the sheriff who is going to be elected to actually be an officer of the law.
I think the reason that it seems like you would want to have certain qualifications is from a legal perspective.
Yes.
You have to have a certain level of education, which is usually the requirement to go to law school. I mean, that's what you need to do to practice law as an attorney or to be a judge. And so it's just kind of odd that some states wouldn't have that requirement, because if we're requiring it at like a lower level job, lower level position, you would think it would be required for something as important as attorney general. But then again, it could be based on other things, like you could still have experience in the legal field. I guess, it's not always dependent on education and things like that. But
think about the duties the attorney general has, like to advise on legal
right.
matters.
Yeah. And I guess it just depends whether, but who's to say they're not qualified? I mean,
That's true.
let's talk about the qualifications at a federal level. So you only technically need to obtain a law degree, but you also have to have a deep understanding of constitutional law, and legal procedures can be helpful. So,
Which
makes a lot of sense.
makes a lot of sense, especially at the federal level, where a lot of the issues as a federal attorney general you would be facing would be questions of the constitutionality of a law that was potentially trying to pass or had been passed.
Yeah.
And it is their job to look through this.
Yeah, and I mean, how do you get confirmed by the Senate without having those qualifications?
Right.
There's that important aspect of the U.S. Attorney General, is that the balance of powers is present in the selection process.
Yeah.
Of course, none of that matters if you get kicked out. And different states have their different limits on that, and it'll vary by state. I mean, there's obviously like 50 states, so we can't get into them all, but the average would be 4 years, with the shortest being 2 years. That would be in like Maine, Indiana, Vermont, etc. But on a federal level, there's no specific term limit set in a statute or constitution anywhere. They generally leave if their president that appointed them leaves. But the longest attorney was actually Janet Reno, who was appointed by Bill Clinton and was the 78th Attorney General, and whom served from March of 1993 to January of 2001. That's about like 8 years.
Yeah, that's 2 terms, which, as is stated, majority of attorney generals leave with their president because another attorney general is getting appointed with the new oncoming president, which somewhat to align with more of their agenda than the last administration's, but you can explain a bit more on that.
Oh yeah, I mean, on the federal level, the U.S. Attorney General is supposed to serve as an impartial figure in interpreting the law. However, the role can sometimes become political, especially when they're being appointed by a select president each term, and especially when the Attorney General itself, the position is so closely aligned with the current president's policies. And the Attorney General must balance being a their legal independence with the president's agenda. I mean, and this can actually be like a failure to do so can terminate the career as a attorney general, like with several attorney generals that were involved with the Watergate scandal. Like the 67th and the 68th attorney generals, John Mitchell and Richard Kleindienst, were investigated for their involvement with Watergate, with the 69th being fired for investigating Watergate, not just for his involvement, but for investigating it. And that was Elliot Richardson.
It kind of reminds me when you said you were talking about the political aspect of it, of Rudy Giuliani and how he originally served as attorney general as a Democrat, but then he switched platforms. I think he switched parties in like the 80s, and then that's when the controversy kind of started around Rudy Giuliani.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
What I found interesting about the Watergate scandal, in fact, 2 attorney generals have been involved in it, but also the fact that the 69th one, the person who was Elliot Richardson, the person that was investigating it, got fired for investigating it. Like, I know there's probably more to that I don't know, but it would boggle my mind if there is such a big case that is on a federal level and the person that is in charge of these federal cases in law is investigating and he gets fired for doing so, for essentially doing their job. Which, as I stated, I don't know everything about this case. I just know what has been stated here, and it just boggles my mind that if you're doing your job, you can be fired for doing your job.
Yeah, I mean, the 69th might have been during Gerald Ford, who pardoned Nixon. So he might have, by fired, that's kind of a harsh word, he might have just been released from doing so that the nation could move on.
Yeah.
And I mean, the 67th, the 68th, they resigned themselves to avoid being directly fired for their involvement.
To essentially avoid further involvement with the case and to distance themselves.
Just like Nixon.
I think everything eventually gets politicized anyway. Is that the right word? Politicized?
Yeah, it sounds fair.
Is that right? Is that the right word? Politicized?
Yeah.
I think everything eventually gets politicized, even if people are just doing their jobs, because even the roles and responsibilities under a certain job will eventually can be seen to have some sort of political sway. And so I think people often jump to it, even if someone is just doing their job, it seems to be that way. Or there could be procedures or policies in place that kind of make it seem more politically biased than one would hope for it to be.
And while even state attorney generals can be very active in pursuing political causes, like from challenging federal regulations to defending state laws on issues like abortion, immigration, or healthcare. I mean, the position is just so close
Right.
to the governor or the president. They're so entangled within making those policies and advising on that it's reasonable to assume that that position will become
Politicized.
politicized.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a given, seeing as they oversee law, and a lot of things in law are hotly debated topics politically. And as you stated, going on about abortion, immigration, or healthcare matters, well, yes, those are heavily involved in law. They're also heavily debated in every level of politics, all the way from the local level to the state to the federal. There is almost no divide between the two, even though they try their best to do so.
They're highly controversial.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but
You're
they're
fine.
highly controversial. I think that's why there's often a debate over these specific topics, whether they should be handled at a federal level or at a state level. Who
Yeah.
should be responsible for this,
Yeah.
And so it just depends who gets the short end of the stick on who has to deal with it, because it could be up to states, it could be up to the federal jurisdiction, but at the end of the day, it's still controversial, and somebody's still going to get a slap on the wrist or scrutinized for just following what either the people want or what they're trying to do within their legal jurisdiction.
Yeah.
So
I mean, especially seeing as from one end of the country to the other, viewpoints vary widely. You can go over one city to another city, maybe half an hour to an hour away, and the majority viewpoint on a topic will be very different. Like, it's just a messy situation that doesn't really have a good answer to it, whether that be legally or politically, which is just one reason why attorney generals just have such a difficult time actually keeping their independence from politics and staying strictly to law.
I think there are a lot of other, more localized issues, especially within state attorneys, that, is a lot less controversial, but still just as equally important. A lot of, like, I remember when we spoke to when the attorney generals, the district attorney general spoke, he spoke about the war on drugs and how they were trying to fight the opioid problem in Indiana, and so I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
And then that obviously differs state to state. Like there are other states where there's more, like in California, there's a lot more environmental issues that they focus on there. It just, and I imagine, well, like in New York at one point, it would have been a really tough battle on gang crimes and things like that.
Yeah, it really largely depends on what that state's needs are, especially on the state attorney general side.
Healthcare is another really big one right now.
Yeah, because depending on state, like you can take a state like Florida and then a state like Kentucky. Florida has a large retiree population, whereas Kentucky has a much larger, I'd say, working population, but also speaking. So Florida has residents typically have a lot more money than Kentucky residents. It's just the healthcare issue there would be extremely different too.
Yeah, and it makes sense that our federal attorney general is focusing more on like international issues, national security issues than
Yeah.
on things like these, because a lot of them do differ so
Yeah.
much based on, what's important in Indiana
Yeah.
might not be as important in New York or
Exactly, and
something.
that's just why it gets so messy legally and politically.
Yeah.
Because you try to take care of something on a federal level, it is going to, I want to say, backfire to some extent whenever it comes down to a state level. Because not every state has the same opinions that other states, and even some states are highly divided upon topics. So it is ultimately just better to leave some topics to state attorney generals.
But, at the end of the day, we still have to thank our attorney generals for checks and balances and ensuring legality in the decision-making process, even if we don't agree with, how they might align politically or how they were appointed or who they were appointed by. Their job is still to make sure that everything is happening in a upstanding and
Yeah,
a legal
fashion.
manner. Yeah, so
Yeah.
have to appreciate that aspect.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do agree. But now you guys know a little bit more about attorney generals, and I guess if you want to become an attorney general, well, I guess you don't have to. In 20 states, you don't have to go to law school, but I would recommend go to law school, learn your people, and try to get yourself elected.
Yeah.
But that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you. This is VUDivulged.
Yep.
Right. See you guys next week.